Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Alice Bentley, and I am delighted and honored to be interviewing Robin Rothenberg about her pioneering book, Restoring Prana, a therapeutic guide to pranayama and healing through the breath for yoga therapists, yoga teachers, and healthcare practitioners. Thank you also to Liz Duncanson, who's behind the scenes doing all our moderating for the meeting today. As usual, the first hour of the interview is going to be recorded, and then there'll be an additional half hour after that for Q&As for those people who are joining live. We'll be taking any questions that arise from the chat and in person in that last half hour, and we just ask you to keep yourself muted during the recorded part of the session. It just helps the recording go more smoothly. So thank you for all those logistics. And I'll start by reading Robin's very impressive bio. So it might take me a little while.
Oh,
So
you
Robin,
could shorten it.
oh no, I think it's very impressive. I think people would like to hear it. So Robin Rothenberg is an internationally respected yoga therapist who specializes in supporting people with respiratory, immune, and structural imbalances to regain their health through the combined tools of yoga and therapeutic breathing practices. She's been highly involved in yoga research since 2000, and she co-authored the protocol and taught the classes for the landmark study, Comparing Yoga, Exercise, and a Self-Care Book for Chronic Low Back Pain, a randomized controlled trial, which was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in December 2005. The positive results from this and a follow-up study form the basis for the publication of her first book, The Essential Low Back Program, Relieve Pain and Restore Health. Robin draws deeply from the authentic lineage of yoga, whilst also incorporating contemporary understanding of mind-body medicine, which is the result of years of dedicated study of Western science. The text we're going to be looking at today, Restoring Prana, was released in late 2019 and has been hailed as one of the most thorough and well-researched books on the topic of pranayama. She's the program director of the Essential Yoga Therapy, an IAYT accredited therapist training program, and currently serves on the IAYT board, previously as president. So, welcome, Robin. It's a pleasure and honor to have you here today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation, Alice.
So, I'll just show everybody your book, I think. So, this is the wonderful book, Restoring Prana, and then it comes also with a very practical and helpful workbook, breath journal, both of which I found fascinating reads. Restoring Prana is such a deep and comprehensive exploration of prana. There's so much material there. And I love the way you blend the Western science with the ancient
Oops, somebody
Vedic
needs to go. There we
teachings.
go.
Yeah, sorry, we had a little bit of interference. If everyone could just check that they're muted, that would be really helpful. So, as I was saying, I really love the way you blend the ancient teachings of yoga with Western science. Um, and your book really challenges some of our assumptions, myths, paradigms in modern yoga around the value of a big breath. I think it would be really helpful for people to hear about how you came to this knowledge, like what inspired you to dive so deeply into the study of both the Western science around breath and then also into the ancient teachings.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Yeah, so just to give you like a little bit of backstory on me, my dad was a scientist, and I literally grew up going to his lab on Saturdays and hanging out there and playing with all, the microscopes and all the things. So science and Scientific America was in our house and National Geographic. So I grew up with that kind of in that was a huge influence to really think about things, to ask questions, to inquire, to get to the why of stuff. So that's just part of who I am. So I brought that all to yoga. Then I also had a history through my entire childhood of chronic health issues, mostly upper respiratory. So pneumonia and strep throat and tonsillitis, ear infections, like constantly. I had one or the other. I had a little pill box for my antibiotics because that I took to school because I was always on antibiotics. So I developed a chronic cough as a result of all my throat infections. My parents would like literally shovel codeine, Phenergan with codeine down my throat and send me to school because I have this horrible cough, but I wasn't like sick. I didn't have a fever or any other symptoms. So respiratory problems have plagued me. And they got worse as I got older in many ways, and not instead of better. And then, of course, we know what happens with so much antibiotic use and how it throws the gut biome off and the effect on the immune system. So I, as a young adult, was just sickly all the time. And then I had 2 kids, and that wasn't a good thing to be sick all the time when you have 2 kids. So then I started practicing yoga and looking at my diet and doing all kinds of things to get myself healthy. And I was getting healthier and stronger and more resilient. And I wasn't as sick all the time, and I wasn't coughing so much. And so I was going on this trajectory. And I was always interested in pranayama, which when I started yoga, I had a good friend that I studied with. We went through many trainings together, and she said, "You're like the only person who actually practices pranayama that I know." And I'm like, because I knew there was something like my breath, like I had problems, other people didn't have problems. And so it did always fascinate me. And then I started studying Vini yoga about 10 years in after I'd been certified as an Iyengar teacher. And that's very breath centric. So I was really drawn to that and like just picking Gary's brain, like Gary Kraftsaw, like everything I could learn about the breath and really practicing these very strong pranayama practices with long inhale and long exhale and like really focusing on the extended exhale. And for a while, I felt like I was getting better, like everything was helping. And then I started having issues, and it coincided with my starting my therapist training where I was teaching 8-10 hours a day for like 10 days straight. And then I had a new grandchild, and I'm singing and talking to her nonstop. If you have a new little baby grandchild, that's one of the things that happens is you're just like, what? Like, do you keep, it's just constant. So all of a sudden, the percentage of time that I am spending talking is increasing massively. And this whole time, I'm very unaware, really and truly, completely unaware of how dysfunctional my baseline breathing pattern was. I just didn't know. Nobody in the world of yoga ever pointed it out to me. None of my doctors ever pointed it out to me. Nobody ever said, we should take a look at this. So I'm thinking I'm doing my pranayama, I'm doing my yoga practice, I'm doing the right things, and then I'm living my life, and it's all good stuff. I'm just like all day long. And I start getting sick again. I start coughing again. I'm like, God, I'm coughing a lot again. And I don't understand why. And then I start getting respiratory infections, and I'm having trouble getting rid of them. And then I got one in 2015 that just slayed me. For 3 months, I couldn't stop coughing. And I was feeling all of the malaise of like chronic pain and chronic fatigue that I had felt as a child and early adult. I'm thinking, I'm going backwards. Something's really wrong. And I am like at 2 a.m. trying to do Kapalabhati or something, anything. Like I'm trying every pranayama I know to get my breath to calm down. Nothing's working. So I go to my naturopath, and she has me breathe into a spirometer, and she's like, she literally says that sucks. You do it again. There's no way. And I do it again. She's like, Robin, you have asthma. And I'm thinking, I had asthma my whole life. Nobody ever diagnosed me. Anyway, I think that's probably the truth. So she puts me on an inhaler. She says, I don't think the rescue inhaler is going to help. I think you need to go on a steroid inhaler. You have so much inflammation. She was right. Steroid inhalers started to help, and I started calming down, and I wasn't so excessively coughing, I could sleep a little bit. But I had a client, a student, longtime yoga therapy student who had severe asthma. And she had healed herself and gotten herself off of all her medications after lifelong severe asthma by doing this non-yoga breathing technique. And so I thought, maybe I should call her and find out what she's doing, because it seemed to work for her. Maybe it'll help me. So I started taking sessions with her, doing sessions with her. And after the first one, my coughing reduced by about 75%. And I slept that night. I slept so soundly that night that my husband thought I was dead. So I thought, okay, something's going on here, because this was the Buteyko breathing technique. And it was everything opposite of what I learned in yoga school. I was learning how to breathe in a much more subtle, quiet, reduced way, and really focusing on breath suspension. And day by day, week by week, I just kept getting healthier and stronger, and surpassed the healthiest I had felt before, and started feeling healthier than I even knew was possible. Had all this abundance of energy, could exercise all with my mouth closed. And that, I mean, this is how I became aware of how dysfunctional my breathing pattern was, because I learned what functional breathing actually was. And there was a big gap between how I had been living and what I was cultivating through intensive practice. And it was fascinating. And then my little science mind said, I need to understand this. So then I went to study with Patrick McEwen in Ireland, and just sat there as he pulled up one study after another, after another, after another. And I'm just like, as soon as I understand the science, I have to bring this back to my friends, my colleagues, my yoga people, and say, wait a minute. We actually need to learn about respiratory science and how the breath works, because we got it wrong. Now, I know that's a big thing to say, and I apologize. And yet I want to say the yogis did not get it wrong, because that's where, like where I landed with Restoring Prana, is that I had this moment when I got back from studying with Patrick. It's like, how did the yogis get it wrong? How could all this pranayama be wrong? So I started studying the original text and reading what it actually says about pranayama. And as it turns out, pranayama is equated with kumbhaka. It's synonymous in every single one of the books that I read. Pranayama equals not breathing, extending the non-breathing part of the breath, and breath suspension in particular to take you into the states of samadhi. And now I understand the biochemistry of why that's true. I also understand that you cannot increase your kumbhaka if you're breathing big all day long. It actually can't happen. You can't get there. You have to actually train your body to breathe less, to need less breath, to be able to be more efficient in its utility of oxygen. And that means you have to shut the mouth and breathe lightly through the nose, which is critically important for health, and begin to work on increasing your breath suspensions. And that now I understand. They're actually ancient Vedic science and modern Western science saying the same thing. Something got lost in the translation in between, and I'm doing my best to rectify that, to help us to bridge that gap and get back to what healthy breathing really is and what pranayama practice is really about.
Yeah. And really that shift from focusing on breathing more to focusing on breathing less is pretty significant, and perhaps counterculture in yoga right now. So it seems like a good time for us to maybe get a sense of what you mean when you're talking about breathing less and smaller, lighter breaths. Would now be a good time to slide into a practice?
Sure, practice is always good. Better you don't take my word for it. Okay. So we're just going to have a little fun. We're just going to play, okay? So the first thing I'm going to invite you to do is And it's always hardest to do any of this with yoga people. You guys are the hardest. We are the hardest because we already have our entrenched samskaras and they're held by very strong beliefs. One of the strongest beliefs, however misguided it is that breathing more is healthier. So just observe that in yourself. And any resistance you have to anything I'm saying, I've heard it before. I've worked through it before. I've had my own with it. So I know. I've lived it. I've lived oh my God, this can't possibly be true. So it's okay. It's just fine. Just be with whatever arises through the whole process. So the first invitation is just to breathe as you breathe, not your yoga breath. We'll get there, I promise. But just like you're standing in your kitchen and you're thinking about what to make for dinner, how do you breathe? You're sitting in your car at a traffic light. How do you breathe? And just notice what you notice about it. The mind understands through comparison and contrast. So that's what this is. We're just going to play with some different kinds of breathing. Okay, so now go into whatever your usual yoga breath is. And I'm not judging you. I'm inviting you to just objectively play with what you already are doing in your life. You already breathe like this. You already do your yoga breath. And how is your yoga breath different than maybe you're standing in the kitchen breath? What do you notice about the difference between those two? And then if you were going to lead the beginning of a centering, right, for a class, how would you guide that? Because it might be a little different than, I hear a lot of centerings that begin with take a big deep breath, like here you're cueing and big sigh out, like hear it and do it and feel it. And then consider a stressful situation that you've been in recently and like, how do you breathe when you're stressed? Like, how do you feel the breath shift when you're under pressure or you're like worried about something happening? You just read the news feed, right? I got a call from somebody that things weren't going well, right? And feel that in your system. And then as you feel your stress breath, because you're yoga people, likely, I'm making an assumption here and it might not apply, but you probably, if you notice that, you're like, you plug into your yoga breath to calm yourself down. So do that. And now I'd like to invite you to breathe through your nose, both inhale and exhale. Place one hand on your lower rib cage and one hand on your lower belly. So your hands are stacked, right? And you can feel the movement of the lower ribs and you can feel the movement of the abdomen. Give your shoulders a little roll and jaw a little, release, tongue a little. These are all actually part of the respiratory system. And let the shoulders kind of bounce and settle down. And let's pretend for a moment that you do not need any of these muscles upstairs to take a quiet breath, resting breath while you're just sitting here listening to me, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So as if you're only breathing into the lower lobes of the lungs on your in-breath, have more of a sense of a lateral movement, just a really gentle lateral movement on the out-breath. But mostly focus on your exhale and draw in like you're zipping up a tight pair of jeans from the bottom to the top, including your ribs. Kind of narrow your rib cage in and just pause for 2 seconds. And then inhale and let it go. The main thing I'm emphasizing here is make the inhalation passive. Focus your effort and attention on the gathering inward of the abdominals and the lower rib cage on the exhale, and just taking a moment to just be with that. And then you're just allowing the abdominal muscles to release, which will free the diaphragm to do its job. And I always say you can trust the diaphragm. It's been breathing you your whole life. It knows just what to do. And if you give it a little rest, which is what happens when you draw the rib cage in, and then you let go, it will breathe you. So notice how this feels and whether this feels similar to any of the other breaths that you were doing or different, and how so. And then I'm just going to invite you to do one more thing, one more layer, add one more layer to this, which is just take an index finger under your nose and feel the amount of breath brushing over your finger. And just titrate it back a little bit. So there's just maybe 10% less. So it's just a more delicate version of this gentle abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, just lighter. It might even feel reminiscent of how you find yourself breathing when you go into meditation. We can talk about that later, but go ahead and take your hand down, just keeping that lighter breath. Let your hand rest again to your belly or on your lap, but maintaining this lighter, more subtle quality of the breath. And just notice how that feels. And then ask yourself, what if this were your default breathing? What if this were how you breathed when you were standing in your kitchen or sitting in your car reading a book? What if this were your start point and everything else was built upon this? How would that potentially change your experience of yourself and your life? Okay, and then begin to transition back to our little discussion here.
Thank you for that, Robin. It was really, I think it's so helpful to start to actually feel it in the body, what you're talking about, and how, like, one of the things that came up to me as I was reading the book was just how much it challenges us to be really aware of what we're doing moment by breath by breath. And so just having that felt sense is really helpful. And then we can keep coming back to it throughout the day and notice how we breathe versus how, well, a healthier, more functional breathing pattern. I think it would be really interesting just to talk a little bit more about how you think we got here, just as a way of um, helping to understand where we're at so that we can figure out where to move forward. So, given that you came to the conclusion that the science and the ancient yogis really had it right. It's all mutually reinforcing and coming from the same place. What do you think happened to get us into the culture of sort of bigger breathing being the right way in our modern yoga culture?
Well, I mean, it's not like I haven't thought about it like a whole bunch over the last 10 years, right? I've been doing this for 10 years, and there's nothing that I can point to and say this is the cause, right? I mean, it's only conjecture, right? I think first of all, life has gotten faster. The original teachings of yoga are not necessarily even a foundational part of a lot of people's training in yoga. They learn asana, they learn cool sequences for asana, but they don't learn the heart of what yoga is about, which is really about transforming patterns. So I mean, we breathe 30,000 times a day, so it gives us lots of opportunity. I just think like it's a great focal point if you want to learn what it takes to change a pattern. And it says right in the sutras, it takes constant vigilance, right? Abhyasa. You have to keep practicing and not be attached, like, right? Oh, I went into my Gatsby breath. There I am breathing, my mouth's open, like, and have a sense of humor about it, right? Like, because it's hard to change a pattern. It doesn't just happen. Any quickie, like you're going to change this in 2 days or something. Yeah, just forget about it. That's not how it works. So I think part of it is our tendency to want things fast, our food fast, our life fast, everything fast and quick. And as we have gotten more stressed, busier, we've gotten more stressed. And as we get more stressed, we get busier. It's like it just perpetuates itself. There's a lot of vata derangement. For those of you who study Ayurveda, you'll understand what I mean. There's just too much movement. Everybody's doing, if you're not doing something, then there's something wrong with you. And so I think, unfortunately, look, the original texts say pranayama is to be practiced 4 times a day, not once a day, 4 times a day. And the sort of like the baseline is to do 120 kumbhakas in each of those sessions. Kumbhakas are breath suspensions or retention, depending on which side you're focusing on. But it's not about how big your breath is, right? It's not about breathe in for 20 seconds and breathe out for 20 seconds. And it's certainly, there's nothing in there that says, see if you can be the loudest person breathing in the room. Nothing like that, okay? That said, when we get stressed, I'm just going to touch on this, on the respiratory physiology, the science, and talk about CO2 a little bit. I know I don't want to go into the head stuff so much. It's in Restoring Prana. I have lots of opportunities. If you want to do deep dive and really study that, it's worthwhile. But it's important to know something about it because it helps people to kind of frame this understanding of why it's easier to breathe big than it is to breathe small, and why breath transformation is so hard as I'm suggesting it. And it's a lot easier if you just keep accelerating your breath. So here's the thing. Oxygen is good. I believe oxygen is very important. Okay. I also believe it's important to understand that unless we're living way, way up, 12,000 feet or something, or we're living in a city like Beijing or, New Delhi or something where there's like very, very bad pollution problems or high altitude where oxygen is not as free and, abundant as it is, say, in Seattle at sea level, right? Okay. Most of us live in places where there's plenty of oxygen. The problem with breathing is not that we don't have enough oxygen. Every single one of you has plenty of oxygen, unless you're, if you have a lung dysfunction where you are not getting enough oxygen, that's a whole nother issue. Okay. In order to utilize the oxygen we have, we need sufficient amount of CO2. And as strange as it may sound, CO2 is the more important biomarker for survival in terms of how our brain and our autonomic nervous system is set. Okay. Because oxygen, how much oxygen we get is dependent on the external environment. What we can actually manipulate isn't that. It's how well we're able to utilize the oxygen. And that's a matter of how much carbon dioxide we have on board or not. As it turns out, when we breathe bigger, we do not get more oxygen in. Only 21% of what we're breathing in is oxygen. 16% of what we breathe out is also oxygen. And as I always say, I'm not a mathematician, but I know that that means we don't need a lot, right? The difference between 21 and 16, I think that's 5, right? 5% of what we take in is what we utilize. And in order for us to utilize that well, our CO2 levels have to be at a certain baseline that's considered functional and healthy. When we breathe big, what happens is we off gas more CO2. When we talk a lot, remember when I got sick? Like, I didn't understand then what was happening. I can completely understand it now. All of those variables, I was talking on all the time. I already had a dysfunctional mouth breathing pattern, slight low level hyperventilation before it tipped me over the edge. And then the asthma and all of the other things like just exploded. And it took a lot to calm my system down because of the level of inflammation that accrued. So carbon dioxide is an anti-inflammatory. It's an antioxidant. It balances our pH and regulates it. It is the number one way we regulate pH in our body. It's hugely important. And we produce it. We produce it by moving. I'm watching Ann Pittman on her walk. She, unlike me, I'm only producing CO2 around my mouth. She's producing CO2 in her whole body because she's moving, not just sitting. So the more we move, it's a byproduct of metabolism. So the more we move, the more CO2 we produce. So this is getting back to your question, which is to say we become more sedentary, which means we're producing less CO2. We're more stressed and doing less physical activity to off-gas that. So what we've got is a stressed environment where we're not producing enough CO2 and we're breathing like this because we feel breathless. And the breathless feeling is not because we're lacking oxygen, it's because we're lacking CO2. So we can't actually utilize the oxygen. It's called the Bohr effect. It is interesting. It's not boring. Bohr, Bohr, Dr. Bohr realized that in order for our hemoglobin, our red blood cells, to release oxygen into our tissues, there has to be sufficient amount of CO2 on board. And if we don't have that, the oxygen will bind more tightly to the hemoglobin. So there'll be plenty of oxygen in our bloodstream, but our body, our limbs will feel lethargic and tired. We'll have brain fog. We'll feel sort of achy. Our digestive system won't work right. Like nothing quite works right. Could have high blood pressure, right? All of these things can happen because of dysfunctional breathing patterns. So I think what happens, like a lot of things, like it used to be if you went in and your respiratory, like between 8 and 12 breaths a minute was considered normal respiratory rate. And it is, in my world, healthy respiratory rate. But if you go in and you're breathing 20 breaths a minute, your doctor's probably not going to say anything. I met a pulmonologist 2 weeks ago that literally said, I said, oh, you're a pulmonologist. We'll either get along or we won't. And he was like, why? And I was like, well, I'm kind of known as the breathing lady. I wrote a 400-page book on the breath. And he's like, what's the big deal about breathing? You just breathe in and breathe out. And I'm like, and you're a pulmonologist, right? Like, that's just, to me, that's just insane. So I think we've gotten into the pattern of like, you do your vinyasa flow, your sun salutations, you take your bigger breath, it's dramatic. We like drama. But actually, yoga is very non-dramatic. It's an inside job of attention, vigilance, observing your habits, working like little chiseling away at these things and developing healthier patterns. And subtle breathing is very uninteresting to watch. It's fascinating from the inside and very challenging if you take it on. Right, Alice? Do you want to share a little bit about your experience since
I do.
you offered to do this?
Sure. No, I mean,
it's been worse.
So I've been practicing subtle breathing since reading the book and the core breathing that you recommend as well. And It's been a really eye-opening experience in terms of shining the spotlight on some of my own, like some scaras, my like breathing practices off the mat that I hadn't been aware of what I was doing. And I've definitely observed some resistance around it because it isn't necessarily very easy. So as I started to practice, there's definite feelings of anxiety that have come up. And, there's the idea of breath hunger that you talk about. And I know the Buteyko method talks about that as well, just in terms of trying to create that, like moving away from hyperventilation and moving into a place where there's a healthier gas exchange. There's a process where you have to get familiar with um, a more subtle, reduced breathing, and that doesn't feel physically or psychologically very comfortable at times. So, yes, absolutely. The practice itself can bring up some discomfort, I think, and shine a light on some patterns which were less than optimal. And then there's just some intellectual resistance to, something that I've been doing for a long time that I've found helpful, that I've seen be helpful for others. To like, there's a bit of pushback on not wanting to shift and change there. So it would be great to hear. I know from our conversations outside of this meeting that that's probably not unusual response for people. It'd be good to hear a little bit more about how you've got feedback from clients and other people in the yoga community about that, and whether, yeah, just your insights into that and how we move forward from there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So it's I mentioned this thing about CO2. And the reason why there's the physiologic resistance is that it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. The more you breathe and the less CO2 you have on board, the more breathless you're going to feel, right? So let me say that again. The more you breathe, less CO2 you have on board, and the more breathless you're going to feel. And I just want to remind you, like the yogi said, like pranayama is really the capacity to sustain kumbhakas for longer periods of time. I mean, we've heard stories about the yogis who could like hold their breath for like 20 minutes or whatever. Only possible if you have high levels of CO2 on board, because the less CO2 you have, the more you're going to feel like you need to breathe. And then the more you breathe, the less CO2 you have on board. Reversing that is a little bit like turning the Titanic. You have to build your tolerance because your body actually gets acclimated. And this gets into the really gnarly part of the physiology, which is attached to pH and blah, blah, blah. So I'm just going to say it's hard to turn it around because your body becomes acclimated to having lower levels. And even though it's not in physiologic balance, it's familiar. Like slumping and having forward head position is familiar.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's good for you. It doesn't mean it's healthy. It's just what's familiar, and what's familiar is comfortable. It's our go-to, like, our snuggly blanket or our stuffy. Okay. So when we try and change that, and it's very directly, the breath is very tied to our nervous system, right? And our emotional system. So not breathing feels dangerous. Can we just get real? It's like, what? How could this be okay? Right? So it's important to do this process, I feel, with a teacher, with somebody, a guide who's helping and supporting, a mentor who's helping you through this, because it can feel like, oh my God, it's too hard. There's lots of ways in. And I'm a yoga therapist, so I feel blessed that I found Buteyko after years of working with yoga therapy and learning how to adapt and using movement and mindfulness and visualization, a lot of other things. So it became a tool for me. First of all, it exposed me to the whole world of Western physiology and breath and the science of breathing and all these studies. And it also gave me this way in of working with the breath, but it felt limited in and of itself. So I really work much more as a yoga therapist and bring in the idea of subtle breathing. It's not like my focal point. And there's some differences between the way I work with it that I would say is more adaptable and user-friendly, right? So I find people get less reactive through these, more, soft and sort of like an easy way into the less. I think it's important to honor where people are coming from. Some people already have a lot of anxiety, so need to work with that. But people with anxiety, by the way, have a high propensity towards hyperventilation. They go together. So if you're doing psychotherapy, and I've had clients like this, I had one client who had severe anxiety, like could hardly get out of her house, sometimes not even out of her bedroom, anxiety. And she'd been seeing a psychologist that I was collaborating with a number of patients in a clinic health clinic that I was working in. And she's had this woman come to me. And the thing is that she was working on all the psychological reasons for anxiety, but she was hyperventilating 24/7. Now, hyperventilation is going to give somebody the feeling like they're anxious. So I started working with her on the breath, and gradually, we had to work so slow and so gentle, but gradually working with her with bringing her breath down. And she came in one day after a couple of weeks of working. She said, I can't find it inside of me. And I said, what? Can't find what? She said, the anxiety. I don't know where it went. Like, I can't feel it. Right. Now, her story was her story, and she was working with her story with her psychotherapist. But was driving the anxiety was really her breathing, right? So the breathing less takes time. It's like going on a calorie reduction diet. If you're used to taking in 4,000 calories a day, and then you cut back to 2,000, you're going to feel hungry. It doesn't mean you need more. You're eating too much, but you're going to feel hungry because you were used to 3,000. So, maybe you cut back to, 3,200 and then 3,000. And then, like that, that's how I work with people with the breath. Understanding that as they breathe less, and as I learned and taught myself to breathe less, even though the practice was hard, the results were so dramatic in terms of my energy and my brain. I told one of my friends, I feel like I got smarter since I started doing this. More oxygen to my brain, literally. My digestion, like everything was I just felt so much more vibrant and healthy. And all the things that they say pranayama will provide you with, all the benefits, like if you read the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and it says, like you'll have more energy, you'll need less sleep, you'll need less food, like all those things happened. And all the years that I practiced, like really practiced the pranayama that I was taught in yoga school, I would feel a little curbing of like kind of taking the edge off after my Nadi Shodhana practice or my Chandra Bhedana practice, right? I'd feel a little calmer for about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
But this is downshift, and my nervous system is just the set point, is just, I've gone through in the time frame since I embarked on this journey till now. I went through every one of the major stressors that you can encounter as a human being, and actually all within a year and a half. And I don't like my breathing kept me, like that was my equilibrium. There were times that I couldn't, like that stress was so big. I'm like, wow, I can't actually bring my breath down. The grief, like I was just like really, again, I'm like a nerdy person, right? So I'm like watching as I'm grieving and unable to shift my breath. I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. Like grief really overpowers everything. there it is. But then when I wasn't in the pool of grief, I could bring my breath back and get my self back to. So I'm reading. I just want to say, diaphragm, you cannot breathe without your diaphragm. I would like us to understand that there is no such thing as non-diaphragmatic breathing. If you're alive and you're breathing, you're using your diaphragm. The question is, how much movement is the diaphragm capable of? How programmed is the diaphragm? Like if you're breathing really rapidly and a lot, then it's going to be calling for you to breathe more. It has a set point and some skara and muscle memory and all that, like other muscles. It also likes to work in tandem with other muscles. It doesn't work alone. So if it's used to calling on and recruiting the chest and the scalenes and the jaw, then that's what it's going to call on, and that's going to perpetuate sympathetic overdrive. And if you relax, remember I said, let's just pretend like none of this was necessary, and really recruit the pelvic floor and the lower abdominals and really bring them in to be on team diaphragm, much more parasympathetic, much more moving in the direction of functional breathing and actually supporting functional movement, which is directly tied to lower back stability, sacral stability. So chronic sacrum and chronic low back pain, also chronic neck pain from all of that. Like it's all tied to dysfunctional breathing patterns, biomechanical, and then there's the biochemical, which I've been talking about, but the biomechanical piece is equally as important. So you can't just like exercise your back better. If you're breathing dysfunctionally, your low back is going to stay vulnerable to injury.
It's the bedrock of everything, isn't it? It's the bedrock of practice.
It kind of is. I know. I feel kind of like, there she is going on about the breath and functional breathing. But where else? What else can we do? Like that's the baseline. And if we're not able to breathe low and slow and light and have sufficient amounts of CO2 on board, I'm going to make a really strong provocative statement. Then what are we doing with these like fancy pranayamas? Like those were intended, like you had a healthy functional breathing pattern, and then you're manipulating the breath to get more of this or more of that. But you don't start there any more than you start with Yoga 101. Hopefully you don't start with a headstand or not a Rajasana, right? Like, can we get real? There's conditioning, and we have to also, in the same way, cultivate the capacity to breathe well first and functionally, and then build from there.
Yeah, you make the point in your book about the fact that the ancient yogis would have been practicing in a much less stressful environment with good posture, with good diet, and just a like simple, quiet mind, and their breath was pretty functional before they then started, manipulating it through the prana. Most people in the West are in a very different position, aren't they? So,
and moving. They
yes.
weren't sitting at chairs looking at a device all day. They had to, if they wanted water, they had to go fetch it and carry it, right? If they wanted shelter, they had to build it. If they wanted food, they had to go procure it. Movement and breath go together. So that comment, you got to work at both. It's not like I plunk people in a chair and say, just sit here and breathe, right? Movement is critically important. Like I said, you can't actually build your CO2 reserves without movement. And then, of course, I work with people who are, unable to move. They're, in wheelchairs or whatever. And we still work. When we still work with movement, whatever they can move, even if it's an eyelash, we move.
And we talked as well about, and you've referenced earlier, about to really change the set point of the breath, you need to, and ancient pranayama practices too, a minimum of 4 times a day. And so it's not only daily practice, it's multi times a day. How have you found that go down with your students and with other yogis? Do you get much resistance on the frequency of practice?
Yeah, I mean, I work with a lot of people with breathing issues, chronic anxiety. That's a whole aspect of my private practice and also, training. And so I have, lots of people who are going through this process at different levels. And I always say 4 to 6 times a day. And they can be like, you can be practicing your breathing in the car, in the shower, when you're chopping vegetables, right? I think it's really important to sit and do formal practice with the breath where you don't have any other focus going on, but you can stay cognizant of it throughout the day. I had a long commute when I started this. I had a long commute, so I would use the time in the car to really be with my breath and even do breath suspensions while I was driving, like at stoplights or whatever, like really like stay very cognizant of it because of the pervasiveness of breathing 30,000 times a day. It's a big pattern to shift, big samskara to change, right? So focusing on it for 15, 20 minutes, even a half hour once a day is not frequent enough, consistent enough to interrupt the default pattern. So I find so I always say formal and informal practice is useful, right? So the informal practice in the car or whenever, where you're just consistently reminding yourself and bringing yourself like, oh, like I would be walking around and be like, I heard you, Rob, meaning I heard myself breathe. And my little mantra is if I can hear myself breathe, I'm breathing too much. Like there's no need for me to be like, right? Or talking to myself out loud. It's like, why are you wasting all that CO2? You can hear yourself in your head. Close your lips, right? I mean, I found humorous ways. That's my way that's helped me because I tend to be very pitta. So the more humor I can bring, the more I can shake out of the drive and the ambition. And I got to get to the end point. It's like, okay, whatever, I'll get there. I'm doing it right now. And I'm doing me. And then I'm old me and then new me. And look at that, me all over the place. So making it that way so that but the consistency is really important. And I do emphasize that. And I find because I offer it up in a way that it's not like prescriptive, I suggest strongly people do practice first thing in the morning, especially if they have sleep apnea, issues with sleep before they go to bed, a good 20 minutes. So they get like a chunk in and then sprinkle through the day. Even better if they can find 2 concentrated times where they can sit for even 10 minutes and do formal practice, like just doing the reduced subtle breathing and building their threshold for CO2 tolerance by developing longer breath suspensions after the exhale. Not breath retention, breath suspension. There's a whole story and reasons behind that. Not to say breath retentions are bad. They're just bad for some people. They're a little contraindicated for people with heart conditions and other things. So safer way to go is breath suspensions. Yeah.
So when we were talking prior to this, we talked about the fact that this is just such a important topic and really trying to galvanize as much input from and education with other yogis in the community. And I know you wanted to offer another forum to actually take this conversation even further. And I think Liz is going to share your email in the chat for anyone who wants to be involved in that, and just they can shoot you an email and then you'll send out details of dates and all of that.
Yeah. So this is because, I presented, some of you were there. I presented this at Sitar in 2016, and like almost everybody from the conference came to one of the 2 presentations, and there was quite a buzz about it. Some people were not very happy with me. They were, yeah. And then other people were pulling me aside, honestly, and saying with tears in their eyes, like, and a shame, like, I think what happened to you with the big breathing, like, I think that's happening to me. Like, I need help. And they were embarrassed in all of this. So I've heard the whole range, and I hold you all because I had to go through my own process with it. And so I am available that you are the people. Like, that I most want to convey this information to educate, to support you through all of your confusions and resistances and all of that. My dream is that I would go to a sitar conference and nobody would start their presentation with, and now everybody take a big deep breath. Can I tell you? But anyway, so that's my personal goal, just saying that. So I'd like to offer that I will make myself available to have a discussion, to do a Zoom call with whoever would like to talk more and learn more. And right. So that's what this forum that Alice is referencing. And you can just email me and say, I saw the interview and I would like to be involved in that. And then I'll put together a list for the end of the week or something. And I'll send it a doodle poll out and see if we can find some times that work for most people. And I'll do a recording of that. Okay. Does that sound good? Okay. Charlene, like that. Okay.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. And you also do some real in-depth deep dives with this stuff. If people are interested, it might be worth, just before we wrap up the recorded part, just highlighting what those are.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is that I have a 15-month online course that I've had people from all over the world participate in. It's a Restore Your Prana training program to teach yoga teachers and yoga therapists who want to become educated, not just for themselves, but in order to teach pranayama and functional breathing to in training programs and work with clients this way. So that's been going on for a number of years. I have a great group of mentors who work with each and every student, supporting them through the process. So there's that. And then, and you can, get in touch with me, see on my website, there's lots of information about that and how to sign up for it. And then I also have a 10-hour online recorded course, and I'm offering that to the folks here at a 40% discount. So there's a promo code. Liz is putting the information, I think, up in the chat now, that you guys would have that available to you, that would be a starting point. And then the Restore Your Prana training program is like really teaching you how to work with it. But it goes, the 10-hour will give you more practice and also more understanding of like the science, the Western science, and really looking at the Vedic science. I pull out quotes from both and cite a lot of studies. Yeah. So, and then I have my essential low back training program coming up in July, which is in residency. And while it also is about the lower back, as I already mentioned, the functional breathing piece of that and how to bring that in and work with people with chronic pain and work with them with their breath and get them breathing more functionally, that will all be tied in together. So if you're looking for something that's more of a combo movement and breath, that would be a good one to look at as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Robin. We're going to move into the Q&A in a second.
Sure.
But just before we do that, I just wanted to remind everybody that next month's interview is with Leela Stewart on her book, Experimental Anatomy, Therapeutic Applications of Embodied Movement and Awareness. And that's happening on June the 3rd at 10 a.m. Pacific time or 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I hope you can join us for that. And then, Shawnee, if you can turn the recording off for us, that would be great.